Good morning. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral, and welcome to the Forum in person. Today is St. Francis Pet Blessing, and we have some dogs in our audience, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of other kinds of pets in our audience today upstairs. We have lizards and rabbits and a pig that comes sometimes. It's quite an affair. In the famous photograph of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on the balcony of Memphis's Lorraine Motel, one man was kneeling beside King, trying to staunch the blood from his fatal head wound with a borrowed towel. This kneeling man was a member of the Invaders, an activist group that was in talks with King in the days leading up to the murder. But he also had another identity, an undercover Memphis police officer reporting on the activities of this group, which was thought to be possibly dangerous and potentially violent. He was Leta McCollough Seletzky's father. Today we're going to be talking about her book, The Kneeling Man, and her quest for the truth about her father's motivations, his action, and his life. Leta, thanks so much for joining me today. We're so grateful that you were able to come, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much, and it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading it so much. It was such a page turner to me. When my wife was a young girl, she wanted to be in law enforcement. And so it made me see the appeal of doing that kind of work. It's kind of ministry in the world. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just kind of what your childhood recollections of your dad were.
Yes, so my childhood recollections of my father, strangely enough, besides the sort of hazy memories of being a baby and just kind of remembering crawling around, his feet and his ankles while he watched football and drank beer. Beyond that, my parents divorced when I was around 3 or 4 years old, and so my mom took my brother and me and left Northern Virginia, where we were living, and moved to Memphis. And so after that happened, it was a pretty dramatic break where I really didn't see my father very often after that. And so, funny enough, one of my most powerful recollections of my father is from this photograph.
Oh, yeah.
And just knowing that this man kneeling beside Dr. King is my father, my mom explaining to my brother and me that, this is your father who's in this photo. He was an undercover, or he was a Memphis police officer. She did not say he was undercover. That was another process of discovery. But just knowing that he was a Memphis police officer and the strange silence around that. So that's a pretty powerful memory, just seeing him in the photograph. And then, of course, seeing him when he would visit, once or twice a year, he would come and visit from various places in the world where he had been, which he wasn't super specific about, and no one ever really discussed, and it was sort of understood not to discuss that. And so these are, very kind of, it's almost like a film reel with these different images that are a little bit disjointed and confusing. And I mean, that was sort of my impression of him is just someone that, while I loved him and knew him as a father and knew that he cared about me and my brother, I also didn't really know him all that well.
Yeah, and I can imagine, too, just being in an environment where secrecy is just like such an important part of it. It's like it must have affected how you learned to keep confidences and what you learned about, what to share and what not to share.
That's right. And yes, secrecy was something that was ever present without ever being explicitly sort of emphasized. It was just a way of being. It was a way of moving in the world and a way of relating to, my father and these issues around him, his work, and the various related matters.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was so interesting just what it must have been like to kind of really learn your father's full story. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just his life, his childhood in particular, like who was he, who were his people, and where did he come from, and what was that in terms of a formative experience on his later adult life?
Yes, and so, for a long time, I didn't know anything about his upbringing, which is really strange looking back. I mean, it seemed normal to me at the time, as things often do. If you've lived a certain way, then the way that you're living, you just feel is something that's normal. But, I had met many of his siblings. He's one of 12, and, other relatives. But I really knew next to nothing about his childhood until I started delving into the story behind this photograph, which was after I had had 2 kids. I was in my 30s. And so, I finally just kind of in a very inelegant way just broke that silence and said, can we talk about the assassination? And by the way, I don't know much about your life generally. I don't know about your upbringing. And so he ended up writing me a document, 17 pages of notes with his childhood story. And so what I learned from those pages and in the conversations with him that ensued was that his childhood was a very painful one in many ways, in that he grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi. He was born in 1944 in a place called Tibbs in Tunica County, which is one of the poorest counties in America, or at least was at the time. I mean, in fact, funny enough, Dr. King, when he envisioned his Poor People's Campaign, the mule train that was going to travel from these impoverished places in America to Washington, D.C., the mule train started in Marks, Mississippi, which wasn't very far from where my father was born and grew up. But his parents, Walter and Lucille, were very loving parents, very pious. But they were poor. They were very poor, and of course, were under this oppressive system that they were all living under. And so his mother passed away when he was a young child, around 4 years old or so. And that is when the family really destabilized and went into a tailspin of sorts. The family lost the land and the home that they had been renting, this land that they had been farming. And Walter ends up having to take up sharecropping, which is the most oppressive sort of enterprise that you could engage in, and things fall apart. There's no one, with Lucille gone, there's no one there to kind of mind the children, these 12 kids, make sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to do and going to school. And in fact, they didn't even have proper clothes to wear. There was nobody to mend their clothes. So my father and his little brother, they were on the younger end of the kids, were just running around, not going to school, and wearing rags. And this is the way that it persists for a while. There are more deaths in the family. But then Walter remarries. And the woman that he married, Miss Ethel, kind of rights the ship and gets the family back on track.
I wanted to meet Miss Ethel. I thought she was a compelling character.
I love Miss Ethel. Yeah. I think she's just fabulous. And I mean, she believed that her calling was to be a mother, and she mothered those children. And through her care and, through the stabilization of the family, my father's able to go to school, he and his younger brother. And my father discovers he loves school. He loves to learn. And he wants an education, but he knows that there's no way in the world that he's going to be able to afford a higher education unless he partakes in the GI Bill, which, is very well known to provide these educational benefits. And so he ends up enlisting in the Army, and, there's a whole story of how, he kind of gets a little bit hornswoggled by the recruiter. But, yeah, that's his upbringing, is one of... there's love there, but there's also a lot of privation. There's a lot of tragedy. Yeah. And he has to face a lot of things that are traumatic. He's got a lot of adverse childhood events, as we would say in today's parlance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he was just carrying a heavy burden from all that suffering. as he went forward. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like his connection to the Memphis Police Department, how he found himself there. I mean, really, he hadn't been on board for very long when this happened.
That's right. And just the way that things unfold is so uncanny. The way that he's sort of placed on this track, I mean, beginning really with his desire for higher education, having to take advantage of the GI Bill, being put on this pipeline into the military, going into the Army.
Military police, exactly. And then having that preparation, that training, which kind of prepared him for the next step. Memphis police beginning to open more to different kinds of people. And him, being right there and ready to go.
Exactly. And so the Army placed him, into military police school. He did not choose this. This was chosen for him. And so that becomes his entire professional background.
I thought about that a lot. I just thought about just your choice of just like the law. And I wondered just if it had anything to do with this whole thing or if it was just something completely separate.
Yeah, I've thought about that as well, because, to my mind, my father had nothing to do with any of my choices. Like, how could that, I was not thinking about him. However, looking back and looking over the story, it just has to have been formative.
Yes.
To not only, just be aware from an early age that he was in law enforcement, but just, growing up and learning more about his government work. And his travels abroad, and in a way that was not necessarily conscious for me. I feel that I did sort of follow in his tracks.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to talk a little bit just about like the historical situation in Memphis. Let's talk a little bit about the sanitation strike. Maybe you can set the scene for us, and then just tell us how that ended up influencing him too. So that's part of his story.
Yes, that's right. So just to set the scene. So my father has come out of the Memphis Police Academy. It's December 1967. He's just a regular patrolman. He's wearing the uniform. He's doing foot patrols and then car patrols. And it's only a few weeks after that, a couple months, in February, that the historic Memphis sanitation strike breaks out. And the catalyst for that is that two sanitation workers were taking shelter in the back of their sanitation truck. They'd been collecting the garbage, and then the rain starts to fall, and it becomes a downpour. And these mistreated workers have nowhere to take shelter. Most of the Memphis sanitation workers, the vast majority, were black men. And they were oppressed. They were underpaid. Many of them were making below minimum wage because of the ways in which their hours were computed. And they were not provided with facilities just to get clean. They weren't provided with equipment. They weren't provided a shelter to go to when it rained, for example. And so these two men took shelter in the back of this truck, and the compactor malfunctioned and crushed them to death. And this just galvanized, not only these sanitation workers, but a lot of people in Memphis, particularly Black Memphians, who just saw this as such an encapsulation of the inhumanity in which they were treated. And so the sanitation strike starts shortly after that. And so the sanitation workers band together and decide, look, we need to combine our efforts and we need to unionize. We need union recognition from the city. We need a dues check-off from our paychecks. We want better pay, and we want better working conditions, and we want to be treated like human beings because, the supervisors in the sanitation department were, usually white people, telling the Black people what to do and calling them boys, not treating them like human beings. So, and men, adults. And so the sanitation workers' rallying cry became, the famous protest sign, "I am a man," to, bring forward the idea that they are human beings. They're full adults who should have dignity and equity. And so, the sanitation strike starts in February. And so, my father, like pretty much all the patrolmen, and I say patrolmen because these were men, largely. There weren't, I'm trying to think if there might have been one woman commissioned police officer at the time. But so they were assigned to escort the garbage trucks during this strike, which were being driven by scabs. The city hired scab workers to replace the sanitation workers. And so, there were concerns that strikers and strike supporters might try to interfere with the collection of the garbage. And so the patrolmen were assigned additional 12-hour shifts in addition to, their normal shifts to escort these trucks, to guard the landfills, things like that. And so my father was one who was assigned to do this. And then one day he's out at a landfill, guarding the landfill, seeing nothing, he didn't see anyone, starting any trouble. And he gets this call, Assistant Chief Lux wants you to come down to Memphis Police Department headquarters to meet with him. And, my father's thinking, am I in trouble or something? I know I got up a little late this morning and I got here as fast as I could. But so he goes down and meets with Lux in his office, and also present in the office are some folks from the police department's intelligence bureau. And there are also a couple of black officers who are there. And so what Lux wants is for my father and another black patrolman to go down to a church called Claiborne Temple, which is one of the nerve centers of the strikers and the strike supporters. He wants them to go down in their plain clothes and just sit in the audience and just listen in. Just listen, see, what are they planning to do? Are they planning to radicalize in some way? Are they going to try to, stop the trucks? Are they going to try to cause some kind of trouble that will be disruptive? Yeah. And so, my father, this kind of rookie, he's 23 years old. And this assignment is much more interesting than, escorting the garbage trucks or sitting there, watching the landfill, watching the garbage, So he says, sure. I mean, he didn't even really think about it, I don't think.
It's like this first little step, and little did you know where it was going to lead.
Little did he know where it was going to lead.
Yeah, and his partner in there was worried about being discovered.
Well, yes, rightfully so. I mean, his partner was outed while sitting there because, not a lot of forethought went into this, simply because, the strike just kind of came out of the blue. So there was no preparation. There was no big kind of pipeline of police moles for this kind of thing. There was no need for that. And so you have these officers who have been seen by
they
folks.
Just changed their clothes. And people are going to recognize them when they're not wearing their uniforms.
Exactly. It's kind of like, hello. This is kind of dangerous. Did anybody think about their safety? But anyway, they go in there, and one officer was recognized, run out of the sanctuary. And so my father, worried that, they might beat him.
Yeah, exactly.
He chases after, pretending to be part of the mob. And, the officer gets away, but my father goes back.
Yeah, right.
And he keeps going back.
Yeah, he seemed very brave. I just remember just feeling that, just in every respect. Can you tell us a little bit about how he came connected to the Invaders and how he became to be part of the life of that little community?
Yes, and so
who were the Invaders too?
So the Invaders are a group of young people. This is a militant group, sort of kind of like the Black Panthers of Memphis, you could say. Think of them in those terms. They read a lot of Fanon, a lot of kind of radical literature, but what they believed was that Black people need self-determination in their community. As an oppressed people, we need to figure out how to combine our resources and how to get free and not depend on other folks to do that. Yeah. And, so they there was an umbrella organization called the Black Organizing Project. And under that organization were all these little satellites. But the Invaders were just one, some people thought of them as kind of like the enforcement arm.
Right.
But really that was more image than reality. I mean, they weren't walking around carrying, open carrying,
exactly.
Weapons and things like that. But they did exude that persona, and they wanted to exude that persona because they felt like, as young Black folks, and these were men and women, they were not taken seriously. And so what was it going to take for people to take them seriously? Maybe people need to be a little bit scared.
Yeah.
And so, they wore the leather jackets and, the fros and, they had, some of them had, invaders across the back of the jacket. So these are the Invaders. And so they want to have community programs to uplift the youth, to educate them. And so that, young people have this sense of pride instilled in them that society is, really beating out of you, figuratively and sometimes literally. And so that's what they set out to do. And so they were kind of working with the strikers and the strike supporters, trying to, as many Black people came together to support the strike. And so law enforcement, of course, was concerned about these folks. They were concerned that the Invaders would try to radicalize the position of the strike supporters. And, who knows? What are they going to do? Are they going to try to arm them, for example?
Right.
Because people were watching Oakland and, what was happening. And so law enforcement, the Memphis Police Department in particular, wanted them watched, wanted
and you can imagine them
information.
not knowing anything about them even. Do you know what I mean? Because
Right.
they are in their white world and they don't know anybody who's connected to it. And so, it's hard for them to even really understand what's happening in their own city because they're so cut off.
Exactly. And then you had this sensationalism, about them in the media. There was a local newspaper reporter who had written some, really kind of sensationalistic pieces, making them look really dangerous. And of course, they've got this name that they chose consciously so that they would look dangerous, like the Invaders, like they're invading. And so they wanted to kind of be seen as dangerous. The Memphis Police Department and the FBI, by extension, saw them as dangerous and, wanted really to ramp up that feeling of danger so that they could sort of impose on them more and crack down on them more. And so my father was in this position where, having gone to the mass meetings at Claiborne Temple and kind of somehow been able to, kind of conceal himself and ensconce himself in this audience, the superiors, his bosses at the police department said, well, why don't you see if you can try to get to know these invaders and see what they're planning to do and all this. And so he's able to do that. He's able to get to know them. My father has a car.
That's what I love, that he was the guy with the car.
Yeah. He's the brother with the car, as Ambassador Andrew Young told me later when I interviewed him. And so because he's got a car, and most of them do not have a car because they don't have any money, so my father is almost immediately named the Minister of Transportation for the Invaders. And so he's driving them around, which is a perfect vantage point to just be the eyes and ears. And, again, he's 23 years old. Yeah. He's not necessarily, I think, aware of the potential implications of what he's doing, where this might lead. What does this mean? He's just thinking, one step to the next. He's on this gradual path.
Yeah.
And, well, if I'm just listening to what they're saying and reporting the truth of that, I don't, he didn't see any harm in that. He didn't see the conflict. He just didn't see it.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, but he must have been. What do you think was the first inkling of just kind of this? I mean, this is such a dumb question because obviously, it's such a racist organization, the Memphis Police Department in 1967, 68. But when did he start to feel kind of like ethically challenged, or that he was faced with kind of these moral dilemmas? Did he talk about that much?
It was tough to get
Yeah, I
that.
can
I
imagine,
mean,
yeah.
at heart, he really is, this kind of law enforcement
Yeah.
type.
He
He's
grew
not
up on
thinking
the
about
farm.
his.
Yeah.
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 And, kind of, I describe him sometimes as a strong, silent type. Not that he's silent, but he's just not somebody who's going to be, oh, my feelings.
Yeah,
How did I feel?
effusive.
He's not effusive about that. But, actually, I think that his first moral dilemma happened before he even went undercover.
Yeah.
When he was on foot patrol in this shopping center called the Lamar Airways Shopping Center, where a group of kids had apparently stolen a car, and they pull up, and so he gives chase with his partner, and the driver of this car kind of, guns it, and tries to run over the partner. And so they draw their guns. My father and his partner, they shoot. The driver gets out, he runs, and he's been shot, in the shoulder. And my father chases him and brings him back. And then after my father brings him back to the scene, there are these other squad cars there, they're waiting. This is a kid, he's been wounded. Yeah. And then one of the responding officers just kind of hits him, hits this kid who's already been shot. And my father just, something just flared in him how could you do that? And yet at the same time, he's kind of thinking, what can I do in this moment?
Yeah, and all the while he's meeting police officers that are just overtly racist to him, and then then at the same time he's seeing, he's part of the system where people are being terribly mistreated.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's this. My heart goes out to him because there's like you said, it's like this giant wall that's like 60 feet high, and there's like this one little door on it, and it's the police department, and to do it you have to be undercover, and it's just like it's the only way to kind of move beyond what his life had been as a child. Exactly.
And from time to time people will say, well, he could have chosen something different. Like he didn't have to do that,
Yeah.
Which yes, he had agency, right?
Yeah.
He could have said, forget this.
I'm an expert in law enforcement, but really what I'm going to do is go back to being a sharecropper.
Right.
Right.
I'm gonna go work at Memphis Sash and Door again and make $1 an hour and have no career prospects. And so, the challenge really is one that many of us face, which is how can we behave ethically in an institution that does not always do so, or that even much of the time doesn't do so.
Exactly. It's such a powerful story. You're right. It's so universal for so many people. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the assassination. Just like what happened on that day, and what was your father's role? Because you're right. It's like it just seemed all these funny coincidences all brought him to that one place.
Right, which is sort of why I can understand how the conspiracy theories would have popped up. There are just so many things. Like, okay, so, you mean to tell me he's an undercover police officer. Nobody else on this balcony knows he's a police officer. And he just so happened to be there, happened to be the person, the first responder in a sense. Yeah. And after that, he becomes a CIA officer. Please. But the reality is, this is life. Life is
full of chance encounters.
It certainly
don't
is.
Make sense from this side, but look different from looking back.
Exactly. And once you get on a path and you're following that path, it can take you to some strange places. And so that day of the assassination, this is April 4th, 1968, the sanitation strike has been going on for, several months and, really not getting anywhere. And so finally, the leaders of the strike efforts, Community on the Move for Equality, which was a group of pastors, led by the legendary James Lawson, they are able to get Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to come to Memphis to lead, these efforts to get some justice for the striking sanitation workers. And so Dr. King, has previously come to Memphis at the end of March and led a demonstration demonstration that actually devolved into really like unrest,
the rioting.
right, looting, violence. People were breaking windows. And I mean, this is the first time that Dr. King ever led a demonstration that was not peaceful. And it was a huge black eye to him. And it was just, I think, personally wounding to Dr. King because, this is a man of peace, devoting, his entire life to that. Not to mention the fact that he's planning, shortly to lead this Poor People's Campaign on Washington. So the question becomes, if he can't lead a peaceful demonstration in sleepy little Memphis, how is he going to lead this mule train to, Washington, D.C., to the National Mall? And so Dr. King is back in Memphis in early April to, try to rectify this and lead this, peaceful demonstration this time. And he's enlisted the Invaders because, there's a lot of speculation that the Invaders were, part of the problem, that perhaps they're the ones that started the unrest in this march that embarrassed Dr. King and that set, the strike supporters back. And so
But in retrospect, we know that it was like opportunistic criminals in the streets who just took advantage of the chaos and did this. But
exactly.
And your dad was probably very aware of that.
He was. That was what he reported, And still you have folks who say, oh, well, with the FBI's counterintelligence program, it's a well-known program of disrupting social activist movements, folks who want to change the status quo. Perhaps they put some agents provocateurs out there. I mean, that's actually not an unreasonable thought, but that's actually not what happened. Yeah. My father was an eyewitness. But so the morning of April 4th, it kind of began like any other morning. Yeah. And so as the Minister of Transportation, my father, drives his car over to Claiborne Temple just to check it out, see, who's down there, what are they doing, what are they planning to do. He runs into one of Dr. King's cohorts, the Reverend James Orange, who his nickname is Baby Jesus. He runs into Baby Jesus, who's talking to these university students, these two women, and they are having a conversation about where Baby Jesus can get a pair of 4-button overalls to wear to Dr. King's march, because that is the look. If you're going to be leading a Poor People's Campaign,
he's overdressed in a suit. You've got to find something more appropriate.
You're not going to wear a suit. Like you need to have that, that peasant farmer look. So, where can Baby Jesus find the overalls? And so as the Minister of Transportation, my father says, oh, okay, well, sure, I'd be happy to drive you around and we can look around. And so they end up taking, I think did they take 2 cars at this point? But in any event, they all get together. They drive around to the different stores all over Memphis. They can't find the overalls. And then finally, they, return to Claiborne Temple, and they run into James Bevel, another, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, person, aide to Dr. King. And by this time, it's, getting to be towards dinner time. It's in the late afternoon, early evening. And so they decide, why don't we all get together and go over to the Lorraine Motel, which is kind of the locus of activity for Dr. King's SCLC. And that's where Dr. King is staying. In fact, he's gotten the Invaders a room there as well, so they can be kind of close and in talks. And so my father drives Bevel and Orange, and one of the university students drives the other. And so they just drive over from Claiborne Temple over to the Lorraine Motel. They pull into the to the parking lot. And when they get there, they see this spectacle. There are all these people gathered around in the parking lot, and they're all looking up towards this balcony because outside of room 306 is Dr. King. Yeah. And he's leaning on the railing. He's talking with people. He's kind of joking. He's jovial. He's laughing. And so, wow, what a sight. And so they park and get out of their vehicles, and they're kind of approaching just to hear what's happening. What is Dr. King saying? And I mean, it's just moments after my father gets out of the car, and he's kind of walking, just kind of approaching, that he hears this thunderous boom. And when he hears that, he knows it's a gunshot. I've heard other accounts where, some folks didn't even know what it was. Was a car backfiring? Was it a firecracker? But my father, having been trained in the military and then, of course, commissioned police officer, he knew instantly that was a gunshot. He's looking, at the balcony. Dr. King falls. And in that moment, he's got to make a decision, but it's almost like it happened so fast. It's almost automatic. Most people are not, regardless of your training, most people are not necessarily going to be rushing to run into an active shooter situation. But my dad is one of these people. And he ran up there. There are a couple of sets of external staircases. He runs up one of the external staircases and then drops down, knowing that, the shooter...
Exactly, still there.
Yeah. And so drops to a crawls across, passes a cleaning cart that's outside of, one of the rooms, grabs a towel off the cart, and crawls over to Dr. King. And he's thinking, okay, we've got to stop this bleeding. How do you do that? He thinks back. He's got to apply pressure to stop this blood from coming. Dr. King's been shot in the lower jaw. And so he takes that towel and he applies pressure. And that is the moment that is frozen in time in this photograph.
One of the most interesting things for me is I just don't know many people who've studied a historical event like this, where there's been so many conspiracy theories about it. You're like the only one I know who studied so much of it. Maybe you can talk a little bit about like what you think about the conspiracy theories around what happened right then, and just kind of like what have you learned from it?
Yes.
Like what have people said about this? Like that it's false and how did you learn it?
Right. So people have said a lot. And, some of the same people have given conflicting accounts.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And so, of course, I have my father's eyewitness account, which is in this book, which is what I've told you. Then there is the account, or I should say there are the accounts of the person who was convicted of this murder, who died in prison for it, who is James Earl Ray. And he has, he ended up dying in prison. He tried to escape at one point. In fact, he had escaped prison before he wound up in Memphis and, according to the record that we have, fired this fatal shot. But James Earl Ray has made many claims, over time. He ended up pleading guilty to killing Dr. King, and then immediately turned around and wanted to recant, and wanted to, change that plea, but was unable to do so. And it's really kind of a shame that there never was a trial. Had there been a trial, perhaps, more facts could have been developed. But because of his guilty plea and conviction and imprisonment, there never was a trial. But he, immediately starts saying, oh, I didn't do it, and I'm innocent, actually. And there was this mysterious figure named Raul who was helping me every step of the way. And he starts telling these Raul stories. And he's hooking up with various figures, attorneys, and, there's a writer that he's working with who, there are these ideas floated that, he could sell his story and make, thousands or more, dollars. And so he tells this elaborate tale of Raul, who many people have speculated, perhaps what if he was a government agent? What if he was a mob figure? Yeah. But, and then you had, there's a guy who owned a restaurant called Jim's Grill, which was in the ground floor or on the ground floor of this rooming house where James Earl Ray was staying and, from which the fatal shot was fired. Well, the owner of Jim's Grill ended up telling these stories. He came forward in the 1990s and was on, he did the TV shows. He did, what was it? The ABC Primetime Live with Sam Donaldson. And so he told the story about how he, his restaurant was a locus of activity in planning the assassination, and that my father went into this restaurant and these other police officers and other folks, and they planned the murder. He told one version where he had something to do with the weapon that was used. Then you had a version of events, or I guess probably more than one version of events, told by a very prominent conspiracy theorist who wrote some books about the assassination, claiming that there was a special military unit that was involved, and all these other various claims. Now, all of these claims have been aired out in various venues.
Right, there's been government investigations. Your father's testified. I mean, it's not like it wasn't studied.
Yes, it was very much studied, many investigations. Department of Justice reopened the investigation. There were congressional hearings. There was a select committee on assassinations in the 1970s where my father had to testify under oath before Congress. There was a civil trial in Memphis brought by Coretta Scott King and the King children for wrongful death, and this was a trial where certain, unnamed co-conspirators, and this Jim's Grill owner were accused of the wrongful death of Dr. King, and they asked for these nominal damages of $100, yeah. And they won that civil trial. However, the Department of Justice subsequently issued a report after, reopening their investigation, for which my father had to take polygraph exams. And the Department of Justice found that the results of this trial were not reliable. So you can see that it's just such a convoluted sort of set of things.
Different stories and different motivations. I mean, you must know so much more about just kind of like the psychology of conspiracy. Like, what makes a story that contradicts like the simple facts so appealing to people?
Exactly, and it's sort of, people want an explanation.
Yeah.
People don't like loose ends. They definitely don't like mystery. And so people want to find a narrative that connects all these dots in a way that feels satisfying. Yeah. And I get that. At the same time, and I think we can see that now, in this climate that we're living in today, some people call it, or they wonder, are we living in a post-truth society where folks almost feel like, there are people who feel like they can invent their own reality. Yeah. And if the facts don't suit one narrative, they create another, and they continually spin. And so, I can see the same kind of tendencies happening with this rat's nest, very aptly said, of these conspiracy theories in my dad's case. And, I was so afraid to plunge into all this and go, right. Follow all these rabbit trails, because I just thought, is it going to make me make my head spin? But in the end, and, having thought about this very deeply since at least 2010, I come back to simplicity. Yeah. I come back to, being able to distinguish what we know from what we can, reasonably imagine and speculate. Yeah, exactly. And really, how, kind of cleaving to the facts and recognizing when we're getting farther and farther afield. And funny enough, I was reading one of Dr. King's sermons, The Drum Major Instinct, one of his famous sermons. Actually, part of this was read at his funeral, where he talks about this instinct in human nature to try to stand out, to try to be the big noise in the room, to try to be notable. And he makes a reference that I never noticed it before until I just, reviewed this, within the last week. He talks about how the drum major instinct is also responsible for, some of the worst acts that people commit, wanting to stand out, wanting to have this notoriety.
Remembered by history, even if it means you're harming people.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can't help but wonder, if that is not an explanation as to why James Earl Ray would have done this, aside from whatever financial benefit he may have thought, that he might have garnered from assassinating Dr. King. Just having, studied his life a bit, I wonder if that wasn't a prophetic word from Dr. King, that it was the drum major instinct.
Yeah. That's fascinating to me, because I have been thinking, I mean, it's just like I was aware of conspiracies around Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and around John F. Kennedy's. When we were children, we were aware that there was like certain Americans who held those views, but it just seems so much more dominant now in the era of Donald Trump. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how it makes Donald Trump look different to you. I mean, those claims that the election was not legitimate. I mean, maybe you can talk about conspiracy theories now.
Absolutely. And, what we have seen unfold, I mean, really, I would say very publicly since at least 2015, leading into the 2016 election, and then beyond, and then going into the 2020 election. And, the false allegations of fraud and storming the Capitol on January 6th, kind of the culmination of, what happens when people believe a lie and are willing to even die for that lie. To me, it just was so illuminating, into the mindset, not only the mindset of a conspiracy theorist, but how it operates, and how that can operate on, in a group of people, on that level. And I mean, in certain ways, it's a little bit of a relief that now the world can see, that this is what happens when people are so wedded to an argument that they will shift facts, they will shift arguments in a flash. They don't care about intellectual consistency, and they can make other people disregard that as well. I think it just shows how, we've got to really get back to truth. Like, as a society, we cannot hold together if we're not all standing on the same ground of reality and what's real, people being able to distinguish, what's real from what is belief, what's conjecture.
Even as you talk, I almost imagine it it's almost like COVID. It's like we kind of catch like a disregard for the truth or playing fast and loose with the truth from each other. It's like kind of like a social thing. And it's I think you're so much better positioned to understand all this because of how carefully you studied this one particular incident. One of our traditions is we take questions from the audience, and so they're working on some questions.
Great.
But gosh, I've had so many questions and there's one I couldn't let you go without asking, and that is just like this research into your dad. Like how was that for your relationship with him? I mean, were there parts of this that were really hard for you? And just even just talking about your family members. Maybe you can talk a little bit about just like your personal involvement with your dad and the effect of this work on that.
Yes. So, that is really one of the best parts of having, worked on this book and having, told this story, is that now we have a relationship where I'm just not sure it would be possible, if we continue to dance around this big, silence about something so important, something so central to his life, and, that's very prominent in history. If we hadn't really hashed that out, I don't know that we really could have this, intimate relationship. I mean, how would that even be possible? And so, yes, I mean, I started the conversation with him about this story back in 2010, and it was really hard. And it was hard to reopen the wounds. It was hard plunging into the story, not knowing what he was going to tell me, and how was I going to live with that if he was going to tell me something that I didn't want to hear. Then what? But I just really, I had to keep going. I had to, plow ahead. And really it came down to, once again, this idea of truth, and that the truth has its own power. And to trust that and have faith in the path and the process that was going to get me there. And it was a really difficult process. It was very rewarding, but it was also painful. And, just having to interview him and, just talking with him to get all these facts and all these details. And we had to go to some very grim places, really grim places. But I so appreciate, and I'm just so blown away by having had the opportunity to do that. And looking back, it's kind of a terrifying thought that, what if I hadn't done that? Yeah. And then, this story wouldn't be out there as a counter to the false stories.
Right, exactly.
And, I think, likewise, it's been a beautiful thing for the family to know who my father is, what his role has been, to know what our legacy is, to know what our name stands for, and not have that fear that I always carried of the unknown and, not knowing what happened. Now we know. And it's been so tremendously, kind of appreciated in the family, and just it's really changed all of our lives.
Yeah, it's funny. As I was reading, I was thinking you went from someone who had next to no knowledge of like who your father really was to knowing so much more than almost anyone knows about because very few people have studied a parent in the way that you have, or even that there's a historical record of a parent. Like you at least have files and newspaper cuttings, and so you can do research at the CIA. But there is a way in which now that you didn't, and I can imagine being scared too about what you're going to uncover.
Right, and going from fear to actually feeling proud. I am very proud, and we are all very proud, of him and the way that he conducted himself in these situations.
Yeah, even just like the word, in the subtitle, it has to have this, but, black spy, you're right. That's what you knew from going in, and you didn't know what you're going to uncover.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, you read this title and, subtitle Black Spy. That raises some kind of connotations.
Yes. Yeah.
And so then to delve into it and realize there's so much more to a life, and there's so much more than just what's in a picture, and there's so much more than what's on the surface or in, a soundbite or a headline or a title.
I was wondering, you probably know a lot more about other, black informant, undercover officers, et cetera. What did you learn from that study, just from other people who are in your father's position, but may have made different choices?
Yeah, I did find those stories really fascinating. And I think what I learned, the main takeaway for me is that, there's, to my mind, a big difference between a police informant and a commissioned police officer who's working undercover, someone who's been through the police academy. And I think there are different motivations there, whether it's, getting paid for information, whether it's being worried about one's own.
One doesn't have a professional ethic versus the other has that, the oath that you take as a police officer.
Right. Or even, if you're in your own jeopardy from a criminal law perspective. And so you're trying to get out of that. So I think there's a big difference. And I just think it also, I've learned that context is everything. Yeah. And, each situation has its own players, variables, and settings that are going to inform what happened. And while it's, it's interesting and it can be useful to compare these situations, I think each story really stands on its own.
Yeah. And that's definitely what I get in reading this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, here's a question. What a genuine thrill to hear your brilliant voice. Can one do this in a time of silos to move into truth for our national community? So yeah, that's a good question. How can we be a nation committed to truth and less to kind of the tribalism that we see?
That's a really good question, because we are so siloed now, just in terms of, how we're getting information. Yeah. We're online, we're being put on these various paths through algorithms, and, we are shown what, these algorithms know we want to see. And so it's pulling people down certain rabbit holes and certain paths? How can we kind of bridge those gaps? And I mean, that is the question. I think one way is events like this, getting together in real life, whether it's in the room physically, whether it's virtually, talking to people, getting to know individual people, having empathy, reading books, reading lots of books, which, books and storytelling are about connection. You're connecting with a story that's, in the pages, you're connecting events, but it's also, connecting us through empathy, kind of getting to walk around in a different place and time and being faced with these different choices. So I think these are all ways that we can really, connect with each other in a way that is, outside of these silos and boxes.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned the algorithms, because one of the questions I had too was just about technology and how that influenced your research of the book too. Just like what was available in terms of things online, and then, how do you kind of sift through so much material that's always constantly being generated?
Yeah, that was a really intimidating part, trying to sift through, all of the vast mountains of information. I mean, it was a little scary, and, just really, I think one of the biggest challenges was figuring out, okay, what do I need to know and what do I not necessarily need to know, and really just drilling down and focusing on what I needed to know and working out from there, and working from the known to the unknown instead of trying to work from some unknown point into what's known, and potentially getting lost. But technology was a huge driver, for not only the telling of the story, but also the unfolding of the conspiracy theories, because once the internet became a part of everybody's lives, that's when these stories start going up online and spreading and catching fire, and people are adding their own bits and pieces, much like what has happened, in this country with the conspiracy theories and, with, the election fraud, the false claims about that. Is that, with these means that we have of communicating, and with these means that we have of gathering information, we don't have nearly so much facility, I think, to necessarily assess that information. Right. I mean, there's information out there, but, of various levels.
We need editors.
And
that's what this book is. It's like you've gone through all this vast amount of information. You've sorted out what's true from not true and presented to us.
Right, and we've all got to be able to do that, to a certain extent about what we're seeing. Even with COVID, as you said, there's so much information, but you've got to, unfortunately, with all this access comes the responsibility to sift through and figure out, okay, what do we know? What is conjecture? How can I move responsibly in the world?
One of my favorite parts of the book is when you go and meet with Andrew Young. And I was just thinking, as I was reading that section, I was thinking there's so many just prominent, you mentioned so many just even in our conversation, prominent civil rights leaders who really are getting a lot older. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just kind of like what that generation of civil rights leaders has given to us, and kind of what's the next step for us to build on their accomplishments.
Yes, and that's something that has really been kind of front of mind for me, particularly in the pandemic. But, just in terms of time, I wrote an article, we are losing a generation of civil rights memories. And so I think that, of course, we stand on the shoulders of these folks that, devoted their lives to fighting for equity, fighting for freedom and dignity. And so I think that what we can learn from them, I think one of the main things, and this is something I learned from my father too, who was, of course, coming at it from a very different perspective.
He was definitely super involved in the civil rights movement.
But just from a different position. But yes,
exactly.
But I think all of these folks, what they bring to the discussion and to our awareness now is the idea that, there is no microwave justice, so to speak, that the road is long. As Dr. King famously said, the arc of justice, moral universe, right, is long, but it bends toward justice. And so I think that's really what we can learn from them, is just staying the course. And I think also today, speaking of technology, we're so accustomed to that instant gratification, that dopamine hit of likes and, reposts and retweets and all this, and getting out and carrying a sign and, oh, we really did something. But the reality is that real change happens really through the day-to-day work that's very boring, that's not necessarily Instagrammable or tweetable, but just, organizing and, pushing in our various ways and, keeping going day after day and keeping the faith.
Yeah, well, your book is such a great contribution. I enjoyed it immensely. I just feel like it just highlights that and reminds us just how important it is to stick with the truth, and just also just how complicated kind of our human condition is. That although we want simple answers, that's not what we get. That's not the life that we experience.
Exactly. That's right. The truth is complicated. And I mean, we can see this even in the natural world, just biology, a cell, a leaf, the truth, reality is complex. And we may not actually be able to drill down, on this side of eternity to the ultimate answer to everything, but just valuing that truth and sticking with that is so important.
Yeah, and just recognizing that the truth is a community activity. It's not something I'm ever going to come up with on my own, and it's not something you're going to come up. It's something that we agree on through doing study and through making arguments, being in discussion with one another, et cetera.
I'm so glad you said that, because yes, I mean, the idea of community, that what matters in life happens in community. Yeah. There's no freedom outside of community. There's no justice outside of community. It's not an individualistic endeavor, nothing that, really makes life meaningful.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful. I could keep you here all day, except I've got to go up and preach a sermon from the pulpit that Martin Luther King Jr. preached at.
We'll be there, yes.
I know. I'm so glad you're coming. I think of him so many weeks there's these steps up, and I have to wait there while they do stuff in the church, and I'm waiting there. I often think of the people who are here and him in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. The feeling is here.
Yeah, it is really here. It is really here. But we're so grateful for your work, and I'm looking forward to whatever you do next, because like I said, there's so many different things branching off from this, and I know there's so much that you didn't talk about in the book, but I know that you know.
Yes.
So we're looking forward to seeing what your next projects are.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Please join us on October 25th online, when my guest will be Robert Sapolsky. We'll be talking about his new book, Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will. He's an amazing professor from Stanford. I think he's like hundreds of thousands of people have watched the YouTube video of our conversation here.
Wow.
You're always welcome to the 11 o'clock Choral Eucharist service upstairs in the cathedral. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word WONDER, WONDER, to 76278, 76278. And thanks again to Leta McCollough Seletzky and for joining us. And we're looking forward to blessing your dogs upstairs at the service.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honor and a pleasure.
Yep, great.